Hello, everyone. Today I want to talk about a historical mystery that sounds like it belongs in a fantasy novel. But it's right in the middle of Japan's early histories. People online sometimes call it Japan's missing 150 years, a stretch of time where, depending on how you frame it, Japan's historical record becomes strangely thin. And when it comes back, the country looks different. Different politics, different technology, different burial culture, even horses, animals that weren't native to Japan in earlier periods suddenly appear in the archaeological record later on. So what happened? Was it simply a lack of written documents? Was it chaos, war, migration, and a restructuring of power? Or did later rulers have reasons to downplay or rewrite certain parts of the story? To be clear, we do not know everything. Some parts are well supported by archaeology and Chinese dynastic histories, while others are debated, and some ideas drift into speculation. But the question is real, and the mystery is fascinating. What happened during Japan's missing 150 years? Let's walk through it step by step, starting with what we do know. 1. Why people call it the missing 150 years. The term missing 150 years often refers to the period roughly from AD 266 to AD 413. This is not a magical time gap where time itself disappears. It's a historical gap, meaning written references to Japan in major external records become scarce, and Japan's own surviving written histories were compiled centuries later, not during the gap itself. So we are trying to reconstruct a crucial transition using incomplete evidence, later chronicles, archaeology, and a limited set of Chinese texts. And the transition is a big one. This period is often placed between two major frameworks in early Japanese history. The era associated with Yamatai-koku and its famous queen shaman Himiko, described in Chinese sources. The rise of something closer to a centralized political order we later call the Yamato polity, linked to what becomes the imperial line in later tradition. Now, I need to be careful with wording here. Even phrases like Yamato dynasty can be misleading, because the early political structure may have been more like a coalition of elites than a modern centralized state. So when I say Yamato polity, I'm describing a growing political center associated with the Kinai region without claiming that we know every detail of how it formed. That's the stage. Now let's rewind to what happens before the gap. 2. Before the gap. A fragmented Wa and the rise of Himiko. Chinese records refer to the people of the Japanese archipelago as Wa and describe a region made up of many small polities. According to the general story drawn from those sources, there was a time of conflict among these communities, often imagined as dozens of smaller states competing. What were they fighting over? We can't confirm a single cause with certainty, but one common hypothesis discussed in popular explanations is that access to resources like iron coming through the Korean peninsula may have been one of the reasons conflicts intensify. Again, that's a hypothesis, not a universally proven fact. What matters is the next political move. The sources describe a solution, an attempt to end conflict, by choosing a single figure to serve as a unifying authority. That figure is Himiko. Himiko is often described as a queen with spiritual authority, someone connected to ritual practices, divination, or religious legitimacy. One repeated element in retellings is that Himiko did not appear publicly, and that governance was carried out through attendance, while her spiritual role anchored political stability. Can we verify every detail of her daily life? No. Those descriptions come from texts written from outside Japan, reflecting how Chinese authors interpreted foreign society. But we can say this: Himiko appears in early Chinese histories as an important ruler, tied to a political alliance centered on Yamatai-koku. Then comes a key diplomatic episode. 3. The diplomatic peak, recognition by Wei. Around AD 239, Himiko is described as sending envoys to the Wei court, one of the states, during China's Three Kingdoms period. In return, she is said to have received titles and gifts often summarized as a form of official recognition from the Chinese emperor. This matters because it's one of the strongest written anchors we have for early Japan. It ties a named ruler to a named political entity and places that entity in a network of East Asian diplomacy. However, even here, uncertainty remains. For example, where exactly was Yamataikoku? This is famously disputed. Some argue for northern Kyushu, others for the Kenai region. The texts allow multiple interpretations, and archaeology has not produced a universally accepted final answer. So if you ever hear someone claim, "We absolutely know where Yamataikoku was," that's overstating the case. We have arguments. We have evidence. We do not have full certainty. Then the record moves to a crisis. 4. A succession crisis. A young queen. And then silence. The story continues. Himiko dies, and then instability follows. Some accounts describe a brief period where a male ruler takes power, followed by renewed conflict, until a young female relative, sometimes named Iotoyo, becomes ruler and restores stability. After that, we have another key point. Records indicate that around AD 266, envoys were again sent, suggesting continued diplomatic contact. But after this point, the written trail becomes thin. The next major mention that is often highlighted in popular summaries appears around AD 413 in later Chinese compilations, referencing a ruler of Hua sending tribute. And that's why people talk about a missing period. It's not that nothing happened. It's that the surviving written record, especially contemporary record, is sparse. Now here's the twist. When history comes back into clearer view, Japan looks like it has changed dramatically. So what changed? 5. The big clue. Massive changes during the gap. Even if written sources are scarce, archaeology and later records suggest that major transformations occurred during this broad period. 5.1. Political transformation toward the Yamato center. Instead of a loose alliance centered on Yamataikoku later, references point toward new leadership. Structures eventually associated with the Yamato region, and later, the imperial tradition. Popular frameworks talk about the 5 kings of Hua in the 5th century rulers, who appear in Chinese records. This doesn't directly prove everything about the missing 150 years, but it shows that by the time the record becomes clearer, there is a different diplomatic and political configuration. 5.2. The explosion of keyhole-shaped tombs. One of the most striking archaeological changes is the rise of kofun, especially the famous keyhole-shaped mounded tombs. These tombs become a symbol of elite power and central authority. The important point for our mystery is this: the sudden widespread appearance of these monumental tombs suggests a major shift in elite organization and ideology. Now, I can't confirm the exact moment they first appear, because kofun chronology is complex and debated by specialists. But the broader claim that kofun culture expands strongly in the centuries following Himiko's era is widely recognized in discussions of early Japan. 5.3. Horses appear in the record. Another major change, often emphasized, is the emergence of horses and horse-related equipment. The idea presented in many popular explanations is, earlier texts suggest horses were not native or not common in Japan. Later elite sites and burials show horse bones and gear, and genetic research on Japanese horse lineages is sometimes cited to argue for continental origins. What we can safely say is, by the 5th century, horses and horse culture become visible in elite contexts, implying some form of introduction and adoption likely connected to the Korean peninsula and the continent. And if horses enter the military and political sphere, that's not a small change. It often correlates with shifts in warfare, mobility, and elite identity. 5.4. Technology and culture shift. Other changes often mentioned include increased use of iron compared to earlier periods, new tools and weapons, imported architectural techniques, and cultural shifts in bodily marking practices, like tattooing. On tattooing specifically, some Chinese accounts describe tattooing practices among the people of Wa, and later Japanese contexts associate tattoos more with punishment or stigma. But again, the exact moment and mechanism of that shift is debated. So the safest way to describe it is, the meaning and social role of tattooing appears to change over time, possibly influenced by continental practices and evolving social norms. So, if these changes happen, why don't we have clear, written records from Japan itself during the gap? That brings us to the boring but powerful explanation. 6. The most practical explanation. Writing and record keeping. A major reason the gap looks so mysterious is that Japan did not leave a large body of surviving contemporary written texts from this period. Chinese characters likely entered Japan earlier, but broad, systematic domestic writing appears, later at least, in terms of what survives. And Japan's major early chronicles, like the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, were compiled in the 8th century, long after the events they describe. So even if oral traditions existed, and even if records were kept on perishable materials, much could have been lost. At the same time, China went through major turmoil across these centuries, including deep political fragmentation. So Chinese historians may not have focused consistently on Japan. Still, one uncomfortable question remains. If later Japanese chronicles tell detailed stories about legendary beginnings, why do they feel strangely vague around Himiko and Yamatai-koku? This leads some people to suspect intentional editing. Now, I can't prove intentional cover-ups, but I can explain why people argue it. 7. The strangeness in later Japanese chronicles, and why it raises eyebrows. The argument goes like this. Chinese sources name Himiko and describe Yamatai-koku. Later Japanese chronicles, even when referencing diplomatic events, often do not directly name Himiko or Yamatai-koku in the same straightforward way. Some readers interpret this as, maybe Himiko was known by another name in Japan, or maybe later political authorities had reasons to reshape how the past was presented, especially if that past didn't align neatly with the legitimacy of the ruling order of the time. But we must be careful. The Nihon Shoki and Kojiki are not modern history textbooks. They are compilations with political, religious, and ideological purposes, shaped by their era. So yes, selective emphasis is possible, but proving a deliberate erasure of Himiko is difficult. That's why, when we enter the next section, the theories of what happened, we should treat them as hypotheses, not confirmed conclusions. 8. What happened during the missing 150 years? 3 major theories. Theory 1. Continental pressure, invasion, and replacement. One theory claims that Yamatai-koku fell due to pressure from groups connected to the continent, sometimes described in popular storytelling as cavalry peoples or horse-riding forces. Supporters point to the later appearance of horses, shifting military capability, and evidence of conflict on and around the Korean peninsula. Some narratives mention alliances with polities in the peninsula and involvement in regional wars. Here, I need to be honest again. From the transcript alone, I can't verify the exact inscriptions and artifacts cited, or how strongly they support a particular model of warfare. Those are specialized topics involving epigraphy and contested interpretations. So the safe conclusion is, it's plausible that international conflict and peninsula politics influenced Japan's internal reorganization. But invasion and replacement is a strong claim and remains debated. Theory 2. Yamato conquest and political erasure. Another theory flips the direction. Instead of an external replacement, the argument is that an emerging Yamato-centered power defeated or absorbed Yamatai-koku and later historical writing, softened or disguised that story. Why would they do that? Because if later rulers wanted to present their lineage as divinely ordained and continuous, an origin story involving conquest of a rival founding kingdom might be inconvenient. Again, this is plausible as political logic, but not proven as fact. Also, if chronicles record wars with various groups, why omit only Yamatai-koku? That question weakens the argument and it's an important counterpoint. So we can say there may have been internal conflict and consolidation, but we can't confirm a single clean Yamato conquest narrative with certainty. Theory 3. Continuity. Yamataikoku becomes Yamato. The third theory is more gradual and, to many people, more intuitively convincing. What if Yamataikoku didn't vanish in a dramatic way? What if it evolved? Under this model, after Himiko's death, the old alliance shifts, fragments, and reorganizes. A new center of power emerges, possibly related to, descended from, or connected to earlier leadership. Over time, that becomes what we call the Yamato polity. This theory has a bridge idea. Maybe Himiko is remembered in Japanese tradition under a different name, or reframed as a divine figure. Some popular suggestions include associations with Amaterasu, the sun goddess, due to parallels like seclusion and ritual authority, or Empress Jingu, a semi-legendary figure portrayed with spiritual themes. But there's a serious problem: chronology. If the timelines don't align, direct identification becomes shaky. So what can we responsibly say? We can say that it's possible Himiko was integrated into later mythic memory in altered form, but we cannot confirm a one-to-one identification. There's also the famous tomb question. 9. The tomb question. Could a giant kofun be Himiko's? Some point to the Hashihaka kofun in Nara as a candidate for Himiko's burial, because its proposed construction period is often argued to align roughly with Himiko's death. If true, that would be a massive clue, because keyhole tombs are strongly tied to elite authority associated with the Yamato region. But this is a highly debated topic. I can't confirm definitively that Hashihaka is Himiko's tomb. Archaeological dating ranges, access, limitations, and interpretive disagreements mean it remains unresolved. So the honest phrasing is, Hashihaka is sometimes proposed as Himiko's tomb, but this is not confirmed. However, even without certainty, the very fact that such proposals exist shows how central this question remains. Now, after exploring Japan's missing 150 years, the transcript you summarized shifts outward to other missing time stories. Let's cover them briefly, just like the original structure. 10. Other missing time stories around the world. 10.1. The missing 300 years. The phantom time hypothesis. This is a more conspiracy-flavored claim originating from modern writers, proposing that roughly 300 years of European history were fabricated, sometimes tied to the idea that rulers wanted to place themselves at the symbolic year 1000. The main issue is that the wider world's evidence archaeology, records from other civilizations, astronomical data, doesn't fit a global time insertion. So the best way to say it is, it's an intriguing conspiracy story, but most scholars reject it. 10.2. The missing 100,000 years in human history. This one is not a conspiracy. It's a real scientific question about uneven evidence. Certain stretches of early Homo sapiens history have fewer surviving traces, making them harder to reconstruct. Two broad explanations are often discussed in popular form. People didn't record information in durable ways, and materials decayed. Population bottlenecks, disasters, or major changes reduced. Traces sometimes stretched into dramatic near-extinction storytelling. Here again, precision matters. We can say evidence is uneven, and there are debates about migration, population size, and cultural development, but we cannot claim a single definitive narrative for that entire time span. 11. Conclusion. What the missing 150 years really teaches us. So, what is Japan's missing 150 years, really? It's not a supernatural void. It's the uncomfortable reality that history is not a complete movie. Sometimes it's a handful of scenes. Sometimes it's fragments. Sometimes it's a shadow, and we have to infer the shape of what stood there. In Japan's case, The shadow sits right on top of a major transformation, from scattered polities and ritual authority toward a new kind of elite power, marked by monumental tombs, new technology, and deeper entanglement with the politics of East Asia. Was it invasion? Internal consolidation? A gradual evolution? Some combination of all of the above? We don't know for sure. And if someone tells you they know with absolute certainty, be cautious. But that uncertainty is exactly what makes it compelling. Because the mystery isn't just what happened. It's also, how do we know what we know? Who wrote the story? And who didn't? What gets remembered? And what fades away? And maybe the most haunting thought is this. A civilization can live an entire century and a half. Wars, alliances, inventions, migrations, rituals, rulers. And if nobody records it in a way that survives, later generations may call it missing. If you have your own theory about what happened during Japan's missing 150 years, tell me in the comments. Which explanation feels most plausible to you? And why? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.